This is Yonah Bob, senior military correspondent for the Jerusalem Post. We have had a wild 24 hours here in Israel and the Middle East. Israel is back at war, or is it? Let's break that down a little bit. What has happened? So around 2:10 a.m. yesterday, Israel did a massive series of airstrikes. In about 2 minutes, about 80 targets. After about 10 minutes, all of the 80 targets were hit, including at least 4 major Hamas officials. One, Hamas's effective prime minister. Another 2 probably also have been killed. The Israeli military is very conservative about when it says a Hamas senior official is killed or not, but Hamas itself has admitted that at least 6 were killed. The general numbers we're talking about that are being reported by Hamas are around 400 killed, 600 wounded, all kinds of debates about how many of them are terrorists or fighters, how many of them are civilians. We don't have clear numbers yet from the Israeli military, although I can say that Israeli military sources have told me you cannot trust Hamas. They've lied a lot in the past, so we'll need to see developing, what the numbers are on that. After that, there was another series of strikes up until around 1 o'clock in the afternoon yesterday, and since then things have calmed down a bit. Right? So we've seen Israel do some additional attacks later in the day and even this morning, but it's been to stop a rocket crew that was about to attack Israel, to stop a Hamas, sea vessel, which was going to try to attack Israel. There have been less sort of like proactive attacks on Hamas or senior leaders. Clearly, Israel is waiting to see what impact the attacks so far have had on Hamas. So part of what happened yesterday was a major, stunning surprise for Hamas. They weren't expecting this. They thought the negotiations over the hostages were going to continue, which is the big background story to everything that's happening this week, how much of an impact Israel can have on Hamas's hostage negotiating position. But what is going to happen next right now? So it appears right now that we're going through a staged escalation, right? Israel has been talking for the last month or so about that it would go back into Gaza, maybe invading the entire Gaza Strip almost simultaneously or rapidly, not the same way that we saw the war develop in 2023, 2024, which was very staged. First, northern Gaza, months later, Khan Yunis, months later, Rafah. So a much bigger invasion. Actually, what we're seeing so far is more of the same, all right? Starting with airstrikes, and only if the airstrikes don't work to convince Hamas to change its position, then maybe we might move into an invasion. Would that invasion also be a slow, gradual invasion like we saw last year, or would it be a larger invasion? That is still an open question. But one reason it does not seem like we're going to see a major invasion, at least today, is the reserves haven't been called up. You can't do a major invasion without the reservists. Israel has a small standing army. They called up around 350,000 reservists last year once the war started. That takes time. It can't be done in a couple of hours. I can also say that the IDF is giving us a briefing in the next couple hours about another October 7th battle. That's not something looking backwards into history that you do if you're expecting to do a major strike in the next couple hours. So it does appear that at least at this stage, we're looking at a gradual escalation as opposed to a sudden major additional escalation beyond the initial massive bombing, which happened yesterday in the morning. So the big picture is the hostage negotiations. There have been 3 negotiating positions lately. The Israeli position has been that it would give Hamas another extension of the ceasefire, about 50 days, right? We've had about 2 months of ceasefire until now, in which Israel received 25 live hostages, 8 deceased hostages. So another 50 days for 11 live hostages, as well as some deceased hostages. The total number of hostages that are left in Gaza is 59, about 22 to 24 of which are still living. So 11 hostages would be about half the number of living hostages back, again, with some deceased ones also. That's the Israeli position to get 50 more days for Hamas. Israel already offered that. Hamas rejected it. What did Hamas offer? Hamas offered 1 live hostage, an Israeli-American Idan Alexander, and 4 deceased hostages who are also Israeli-Americans. This was thought by Hamas as a way to maybe placate President Trump in the United States, that maybe he would press Israel to cut a deal for less because they were offering sort of all of the Israeli-Americans that they were still holding, so to speak. Meanwhile, the United States did try a mid-level point. They said, okay, 5 live hostages as well as some deceased hostages. Now, probably the truth is that if Hamas accepted the American position, the United States would probably lean on Israel to accept that position too. Or if Hamas moved close enough to the American position. But as long as Hamas is sticking to 1 live hostage and deceased hostages, as opposed to 5 or 11, the Israeli position, that is the point where things broke down, where Israel said, okay, we need to shift Hamas's perspective, make them feel vulnerable again. After 2 months of receiving tons of food aid, which could keep them going, even though there's been all these reports about Israel closing off the food aid that Hamas received during those 2 months was probably enough for several more months. So Hamas is not yet under pressure, at least not until Israel started the airstrikes yesterday, including against some of their senior officials. So this is Israel trying to communicate to Hamas, using military force to communicate to them, if you don't make concessions, you don't have immunity, we could make all of this a lot worse for you again. So what was the exact timing that happened here? I would argue, and I have evidence from various sources, even though nobody wants to say it explicitly, that this happened right after the United States started multiple days of strikes against the Houthis in Yemen. Right? The Houthis in Yemen are the last piece of Iran's proxy axis that is still able to really viably attack Israel. The beginning of the war, right? It wasn't Israel against Hamas. Israel was fighting Hamas, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iranian militias in Syria, Iranian militias in Iraq, the Yemen Houthis, and at different points in the war, also Iran. Also, of course, Hamas in the West Bank. So all of those different forces now have been either taken out of the game or severely weakened. We haven't heard a peep out of Hezbollah or out of most of those other parties. The Houthis in Yemen were the one piece who could still fire no less than ballistic missiles. We're not talking about rockets. Ballistic missiles, which are much more powerful and harder to shoot down. So the United States attacked them first. I believe this was coordinated between the United States and Israel. Israeli officials didn't want to talk too much about the coordination. They said, yes, we let the United States know in advance, but it's understandable why they would say that. They want to show that Israel doesn't, need approval, so to speak, even from President Trump to defend itself. However, it appears to be, if you look at the way the U.S. officials talk about it and the exact timing when Israel came in, the idea was that the United States would overwhelm the Houthis, for the first time attacking some of their leaders, right? Israel has attacked the Houthis, counterattacked them about 5 times since July 2024. The United States had attacked the Houthis a number of times, but never gone after their leaders. There were always restraints on what could be attacked. So this Trump ordered attacks against the Houthis were much more aggressive, and so far the Houthis have managed to shoot 1 ballistic missile against Israel. Israel shot it down somewhere around the area of Saudi Arabian airspace. But besides that, there has not been a lot from the Houthis. This was probably a serious part of the timing coordinated between Israel and the United States. One other major piece of all of this is the casualties in Gaza, right? We're talking about, according to Hamas, and again, Hamas has exaggerated and lied in the past, but sometimes their numbers are actually fairly accurate. They've said 400 dead, 600 wounded, which all occurred basically in the morning, yesterday in the morning. Israel will say that it was targeting Hamas senior leadership, Hamas mid-level leadership, but were all of those 400 who were killed Hamas, or all of the 600 who were wounded? Again, assuming those numbers are correct, but even if they're not correct, even if it's half that number, Israeli officials have admitted to me, definitely there were civilian casualties. There's no other way to do it when Hamas is using human shields and turning the entire Gaza Strip into one big human shield. But what those numbers are important. And yet, there's a difference in how they're being received. If the Biden administration was still in office, probably Israel's attack wouldn't have been this aggressive. To have one day kill 400 in Gaza, 600 wounded, it would have been too much for the Biden administration. There could have been a severe crackdown. There could have been a weapons freeze, right? We did see that the United States in May of 2024, granted after several months of war, did freeze partially some of the weapons it was sending to Israel to influence the way that Israel is conducting the war. So Israel probably wouldn't have been this aggressive all in one day if Biden was still in office, because Trump is in office and he basically has said, open the gates of hell, sometimes even sounding more aggressive than Israeli officials. They felt able to unleash a much more powerful attack yesterday, even if there would be civilian casualties. Again, the hope is that the targeting worked, that there were fewer civilian casualties, and we'll get more reports from Israel later about what they think the real numbers were. But even the idea of going in this strong probably would not have happened without Trump in the White House.